I'm Jeff Bond, senior editor of Film Score Monthly magazine, and we're talking to John Ottman, who's not only the editor but also the composer of The Usual Suspects, and he actually used this film as a springboard to launch his composing career. So what I'd like to talk about is, first of all, how did you convince your director, Brian Singer, with whom you had worked before, to let you compose on this film as well as edit?
Well, it's sort of like a mutual blackmail process. On our first feature, I was the editor on the movie. It was called Public Access. It was this very low-budget film that in the 11th hour, the composer dropped out. And so Brian's back was up against the wall, and I had been dabbling as a hobby in film scoring with some used equipment I'd gathered together from a paper which sold used electronics. And the joke of it is that all the music I'd been writing was very, as he would put it, flowery. It was very la-di-da, saccharine, and it was for industrial films like Quickset Lock Company and Ampco parking videos. And but his backup was up against the wall, and I had just edited this film and knew it really well. So I said, look, I can score this movie. And he goes, yeah, but can you do dark music? And I go, yeah, I mean, I know this character really well. I can do it dark, but sort of have this empathetic tone in the score. And of course, he had no idea what I was going to be able to do. And of course, the joke of it now is it worked out well, and the joke is now that's all I get hired for: sinister, creepy, dark, brooding, depressing music. But when I didn't start out that way, but so that worked out really well, and we discovered a sort of symbiosis that occurred when I did the editing and the scoring. So on Usual Suspects, he says, you're not going to score this movie unless you edit it. And I said, well, I'm not going to edit it unless I score it. So it was a foregone conclusion because he put in his deal that I was to do both, and it was a terrifying thought for me because this was now a real movie we were going to do, and I had never done both before on a movie of that level.
I'd like you to discuss how you worked in the editing process before you actually started scoring the film, because films are usually cut to music. Editors use music to establish the rhythm of their cuts. So how did you actually work with that before you started scoring?
Well, after I've got my cut together to sell the cuts to the director or executives, it helps to have music to show what you're thinking and to basically help the rhythm or smooth over rough parts. And so being a soundtrack fan, I just got out my cassette tapes at that time and transferred them all to mag film, which is the sprocketed, basically magnetic tape, and started editing in a temp score. And aside from the point that the edits were really rough, and they were just butt cut, there was no crossfades. It's like one score just go into the next score. The fact is, I did a really good job because this movie was really right up my alley in terms of the kind of scores I would listen to, which were a lot of Goldsmith scores and Williams scores, and I wanted the film to have the elegance of that kind of composing as opposed to something jazzy or very crime-like. And so it not only helped sell cuts, but it helped sell the concept of the movie to the executives that this is the kind of sound this film is going to have musically. The bad part about it as a new composer is I became my own worst enemy because the temp score was so good that I was then begged to compose stuff that was very close to what the temp was. And the only saving grace is I fortunately had come up with a theme independent of the temp score prior to temping it. So I feel not so guilty because the theme was hearkened throughout the movie, and so it did give me beginnings of what was my signature as a composer.
You did use pre-existing music to temp the film, which has become a big issue in film scoring because of how lots of composers are forced to copy music that's already been written. So you had this experience on The Usual Suspects, but then your music was not only tracked into a trailer, which you worked on and created, but also wound up showing up in numerous other films and trailers.
Right. It's kind of funny. It's sort of ironic, but I think it's an honor for you to suddenly hear your score pop up in trailers everywhere, or even in other films, because I understand that a composer was probably asked to do that. And I've heard my music in I won't name the films, but I've heard them in a couple films, sometimes literally, like literally just lifted and put in. And in fact, there's a funny story. When I was scoring one movie, I heard the temp score, and I thought, oh, you scored with The Usual Suspects. He goes, no, we didn't. We scored with this other film. And I'm like, oh, because it's exactly The Usual Suspects, but slowed down. It was weird. I go, I said, what did you do? Did you slow that music down or something? He goes, no, it's from this other film. And then I realized that this composer basically had to take that, but his take on making it seem different was that he just slowed the pace down. So it is kind of funny, but I don't mind it at all.
You talked about using music from John Williams and Jerry Goldsmith.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a particular period of film music that you're drawn to?
Yeah, well, this made sense both thematically for our movie, but also me in terms of taste of film score music. I mean, to me, the heyday, because of just my age and when I started listening to being cognizant of film music was the 70s and 80s, and we're ending around the early 80s. I thought the 70s were basically the pinnacle of film scoring. And of course, there are your dogs as well, your terrible scores. But basically, the philosophy behind how scores were done and the attention given to them and the reverence for them was more than it is today in terms of an artistic merit behind them. And because The Usual Suspects was also, we thought, harkening back to a film like would be made in the 1970s, where it's sort of from the point of the filmmakers and not test audiences and so forth, that kind of score made sense also to sort of complete the puzzle as in the terms of the kind of movie we were trying to make. I remember my roommate, when we were showing a cut on the flatbed one night, walked in and he goes, "This movie kind of reminds me of Serpico," and then Brian looked at it and goes, "That's such a great compliment, thank you," because that was kind of what we were trying to do.
And were there any other specific models in terms of scores? Are there specific Goldsmith or Williams scores you want to talk about, or not in terms of exactly?
There were so many. I literally would go to one score to another score to another score because I knew so many of them by heart. It's back when I used to collect film music, and now that I write it, I don't even listen to it anymore. It's awful because it's become work now. So now I don't even buy them anymore. So it's terrible how your recreational activities sort of get ruined by when you actually start doing them professionally. But I can name Outland and obviously JFK and geez Louise, there's so many. Basic Instinct in some places, not the theme, but some other cues. And but there literally, I would say, at least 30 scores that all of a sudden I would go to some. I would put in some obscure score like a Ken Wanenberg score for the Philadelphia Experiment. It's like every little thing worked just right. Too well.
And how do you feel about then sort of the working process that composers have to deal with today? They're obviously exposed to temp scores like this, and I think as a composer you want to sort of come up with a unified concept and have everything fit together into a real architecture. Is it possible to do that anymore in your experience?
Yeah, there are many different ways you can get away with not having to be a slave to the temp score, and I've learned, unfortunately, I don't do 6 movies a year like a lot of composers, so I can afford to come on a film really early and say, you know what, just as they're starting to put their temp score together, and I immediately diffuse it as fast as I can and come in and I will do my own renderings and actually on many occasions I've temped the film completely for their test screenings with my synthesized renderings of my score. So it may not sound as good as using some soundtrack music, but emotionally it's exactly correct, and it doesn't get them locked into something that is wrong. But it takes a hell of a lot more time, and I can't crank out 6 scores in a year if I'm on the film for so long. But it's important to me because I can leave a movie feeling not guilty at all. There's very few things I've had to rip off since my first couple films, and really came into my own style. So I think when you hear an Ottman score, it sounds like, oh, this is like an Ottman score, which is a great thing. You hear John Barry, it's John Barry. And it just happened. And it happened because I just stopped listening to, it's terrible, but I stopped listening to CDs, and I sit there now at the keyboard and just start playing and figure things out and stumble across things, and that's how I write. I never refer to any scores anymore, which is what I used to do out of fear, But because you start gaining as you work on more films, a confidence in your own ability to do your own original music. And in the beginning, you're not so confident. You're timid, and so you err on, oh well, that score sounded good. I better do something like that. But now I just sit there and write. And sometimes something may sound like something else because of a fluke, or on a rare occasion there might be a cue that they're just adamant about. But I think overall I've been able to sort of get myself away from that. But it's true. Many composers, they're slammed in, the last second because they're normally they're doing a lot of films, and the post-production time is so short that they're thrown in at literally within a few weeks of writing the score, and so. For expedience, all they have to go on is a temp, and everyone in the crew has heard this temp score for months, and they can't imagine anything being different from the temp score. And that's what happened on people well know on a film I did, H2O. They had test screenings that rating in the 90 percentile, the extremely successful test screenings, and they temped with music that Miramax owned. And I came along very late in the process and had to crank out a whole score within a couple weeks. And the executives were so used to that temp score, and they knew that worked. And it ain't broke, don't fix it. And so a lot of the score that I wrote was thrown by the wayside, and because there was no time to even test it with my score, or and I'm sure the test would have been the same or more. Who knows? But so that can happen. Yeah.
And how do you think the function of film music has changed over the years? And on something like The Usual Suspects, you actually got to do at least a kind of psychological scoring where you're suggesting things under the surface, but a lot of directors don't really want to do that anymore, and actually things now are so above board in terms of what you can show characters doing that it's not necessary to do that a lot. Yeah,
it's a fine line, because I like to create character themes, but then again, you don't want it to be caricature-like, where every time a character walks in the room, it's there's what's-her-face's theme, and that gets a little cheesy. But still, I think we've fallen so far away from the traditions of film scoring. It's basically a sound design element now, and because of the time a composer has, and because of the philosophy of the filmmakers these days, scores are operating on a very service level. They are working in terms of keeping pace. They're working in terms of adding sound to a scene that would otherwise be dead, but they're rarely going further than that. They're rarely digging below the surface, and there's many reasons why this is happening, and one is filmmakers really want to assault the audience with effects constantly, and the score just becomes another one of those sound elements. But the other reason is composers themselves don't have a lot of time now, and for a number of reasons, and they don't have. It takes a tremendous amount of time and discipline to look at a film and map out how you're going to tell a story musically. I have this theme. It's not going to be. I'm not going to blow my wad here. I'm going to sort of whet the audience appetite with it, and it takes a lot of planning to basically you're writing sort of a symphony in a way, and it's just that sort of discipline and mindset has sort of fallen by the wayside a little bit, and I'm a sort of a diehard film score freak, and so it's sort of an art form to me that has died a little bit in that regard. There's less reverence for spending the time to think about how you can psychologically and character-wise elevate the movie and bring out isms from characters that weren't there before. And Suspects is I think an example of that, where the music isn't operating as just a sound tool to keep things interesting. It's working on a psychological level and a character level. And to me, those are the most rewarding scores, but they're also very difficult to do.
And how is do you feel your style has changed since Usual Suspects? You started off right away with a kind of a mix of very sort of atmospheric and textural soundscapes and very strong motifs and themes. But your later work seems more textural and atmospheric, and in some of the scores. Has that been a conscious metamorphosis
it's
for you?
Totally unconscious. I mean, but I remember on Incognito, which was the first time I really sat down to sort of like, I'm not going to refer to anything, I'm just going to write this score, because I had finally gained the confidence level to do that. I had much less fear. And that's what came out of it. That's why I like that score so much, because I have no guilt at all in that score. And it's even though that film was supposed to be, but no one saw it, of course, but a classically driven score, it sort of defined my style a little bit, because my style tends to be atmospheric, but also have this classical nature to it. I don't know if you hear that, but I do.
Yeah,
I like God.
definitely.
It's like I listened to classical music my whole life, but I didn't, and that's sort of become my, in a nutshell, that's sort of become my style in a way. Even if I'm doing something quirky, I tend to have this classical sense to it, and that's sort of become what I do. But did I answer that correctly?
Yeah, and I mean,
All the way?
I would say Incognito is one of the scores of yours that sort of has taken off on a life beyond the movie, since nobody saw the movie. How do you feel about that element of film scores? It's one of the few elements that really is separated from the movie and sort of sold as a commodity on its own. It takes on its own life. So how do you feel about sort of the albums that are created from your work?
Well, I mean, it's been one of the most important things to me to. I mean, I guess I'm not jaded enough where I'm like, oh, I've recorded that score, I'm going to the next movie. Who cares if it gets released on a CD or not? You know, it's a job. But because you know, it's like I work so hard on each film. It's like it's tragic for that music not to be heard, because half the time it's under sound effects or dialogue. So I just feel like there was an event that took place. There was an orchestra there. It's a really special situation. It doesn't happen every day. So this music should be heard, not just because it's mine, but I mean, every time there's a scoring session in town, it's an event that occurs, and someone's labored a long time on this music. Someone should hear it. And even though there's a small niche of people worldwide that really go out and buy an orchestral film score, unless it's for a major film, nevertheless, it's sort of psychologically for me, it's something to just have out there. It's like, okay, that's done. I can move on, you know. And so that's why I sort of made sure that almost everything I do is on a CD in some way.
And what do you want to do now? What's the one film genre that you feel you haven't explored, or what would be a dream project for you?
I always say my dream project would be like a Dances with Wolves kind of movie, you know, long notes. I'm always stuck in these very frenetic scores, very complicated, and I try to be sweeping, like, you know, like in some scores, like, you know, the apt pupil title sequence is my sort of hint that, look, I can do big, broad strokes, but still it's dark, and it's, you know, it's too active, and I would like to sort of I think I could fill that John Barry niche really well. So I don't know. That's sort of the kind of scores I'd love to sort of get in more. Is one that sort of are calm, and they have recurring themes that are simple, and you know, like I said, lots of long notes that are easy to get through in a short time in a scoring session.